I'm a researcher at the Oxford Internet Institute. I'm going to talk about a project that we just started a few months ago. So on one hand, that means this is kind of early stage work, but on the other hand, it also is kind of the exciting moment where you're exploring and you're finding loads of random things and so on. So I want to share a bit of the kinds of things that we're currently looking at. But before I start, I want to get a sense of how much you already know about the topic. So maybe can you first ask who here knows what the Darknet is or has a broad sense of what the Darknet is? That's almost everybody. Let's see, can I? Yes. So for those who don't know, the Darknet is really just a part of the internet where you use specific software to access internet content. This here is a software called Tor. It works just like an internet browser, but in addition to that, it encrypts your communication between either you or a web server or you and another person. So when you visit websites using Tor, your ISP, your internet service provider, and your government cannot observe what it is that you're doing online. It's important to say that this is legal, and in my personal opinion also, I think it's important to have these kinds of things. Why is maybe a discussion for another day. So this is the first part, this is the Darknet. Who here has a broad understanding of what a Darknet market is? This is maybe half the room. So Darknet markets use these kinds of Darknet technologies to create online spaces that hide from the law. And it's important to say right at the beginning that this is largely criminal activity. Here is the Silk Road is the first, most widely known online marketplace. It became famous for a number of things, in part because it became really popular really quickly, but also for the kinds of things that you were able to buy online. So the screenshot gives you a broad sense. There's marijuana cookies, there's all kinds of pills, different kinds of mushrooms, and so on. Also, on the left, you see various categories of products that are being offered. So those markets, they use this kind of encryption technology to serve content, so you can see it without being observed. And then they use digital currencies like Bitcoin for the actual transaction. At the OII, the Oxford Internet Institute, we're trying to understand these kinds of marketplaces, trading on these kind of marketplaces from a specific perspective. We're trying to understand the economic geography. The economic, when people research with a perspective on economic geography, they're trying to understand what kind of economic activity happens in certain places but not in others. And we, in our early tests, we observed there's a geographic component to this kind of trade, and you'll see quite a few examples of that. So fundamentally, our research is trying to understand this in more depth in relation to this specific social phenomenon. And as part of this, we also, and this is also one of the reasons why we are speaking about this so early, we are trying to build a reusable data set of the kinds of products and the kind of trading that happen in these places, so that the public and other researchers can make use of the data. We are not sharing it just yet. You're just getting an early glimpse, but you'll get a sense of how we're building the data that we're going to share. It's also important for us to say, this is independent research. We don't work with law enforcement. We also don't work with platform providers. We don't build profiles of individual trading behavior. We cannot even observe individual people's trades. We can observe some indicators of that, which you will see in a bit. But broadly speaking, we go to these marketplaces. We download data at large scale, which I will show you examples for. And then we analyze it, we map it, and so on. We first started this work in May, trying to assess what marketplaces are currently active. Generally, there are always loads. Also, generally, they don't necessarily live long. Sometimes they get taken down by the law. Sometimes operators close them. So there are various lists online that are not hard to find that give you addresses for these kinds of marketplaces. So we looked at all these lists, made lists of marketplaces, made our own kind of meta list of marketplaces, visited all these marketplaces. First of all, not yet downloading all their data, but just to try and understand how much products is every market offering. So here you see on the left, there's a design pattern that markets often use, where they have a list of categories in their menu structure, and for every category they show you how many products are listed in this category. And we simply use this as an indicator how big is this particular marketplace. And based on that, we build a ranking, made spreadsheets, trying to understand which markets are kind of the big ones. And we found that it's a highly concentrated activity. There's a very small number of markets, which accounts for 80-90% of the global catalog. So we focused first on getting data for these kinds of markets. So what does it mean when we get data? It means for every market, we look at all their product listings. And then for those product listings, we extract specific pieces of information that we can then use for research. These markets, they work just like Amazon or eBay or an online shopping site, in that for every product, typically you have a dedicated page. We have a title, a name for the product. You have a price. Interestingly, also for these marketplaces, for every product, often you have a geographic indicator. And there are kind of two parts to it. The first is vendor have the ability to say, this is the country from which I'm providing the product. This is essentially the country from which I'm going to ship it to you. And the second bit is, these are the countries that I'm willing to ship to. So in this case, the vendor is in the United States and is willing to ship worldwide. Why would they do that? Well, if you're shipping contraband, if you're shipping illegal products through mail, which is generally what people do, in certain countries, customs are fierce. Also, generally, when you're shipping it through mail, there are all kinds of risks of it being identified. So this allows consumers to kind of assess the risk. Should I get it from China or should I get it from my own country? And for us, of course, so this was introduced to manage kind of risk on these markets. But for us, is a really interesting indicator of activity. So we scrape all this data from all those markets, create essentially a big spreadsheet. 250,000 products are currently in our database. The first thing we can then do is just create an overview. So what are the countries of origin? Where do products generally come from? This here is a tree map. You might be familiar with the format. Every box here represents a country. Boxes are also grouped. These are countries in Europe. This is North America, Oceania, or Australia and New Zealand, Asia. Here's the biggest box here, undeclared. I'll come back to that later, but the biggest chunk here of 30-40%, these are items where no country of origin is listed. Right next, or similarly big, there's a lot of stuff coming from Europe. There's a lot of stuff coming from North America. Okay, what else can we find? Let's try and understand what kind of products are being traded. At the moment, we are in the process of building a taxonomy to get some structure for these 250,000 products. We're not all the way through yet. At the moment, it's quite a basic taxonomy. I think we have about 70 categories grouped into a hierarchy. Broadly speaking, the stuff that is being traded, a lot of it is drugs, which is the blue stuff here. There's a lot of recreational drugs, kind of the classics, cannabis, MDMA and ecstasy, stimulants like cocaine, speed. You will also find pharmaceuticals, painkillers, sleeping pills, ADHD medicine, psychoactive substances. There are emerging categories of what is called new psychoactive substances. These are, or used to be called research chemicals. These are often or designer drugs is another term for it. These are often these are not well understood, and these are often quite young drugs, and they're often also not clearly labeled. So there is an emerging drug category, which I think in the 21st century this will be more and more in the news. We're already in the UK. We're already seeing it a bit with spice, which is one substance of that nature, which is essentially a synthetic cannabinoid, and it's really dirty. It's really dangerous. It destroys lives. So, if I'm talking here about recreational drugs, I'm not. It's not my place to judge people's preferences, but I want to say clearly this is not necessarily harmless activity. A lot of this is very explicitly criminal. Some of it lethal. Also information trading, credit cards, bank accounts, and so on. What else can we find? What other kind of information can we look at? So as I said earlier, we can't observe individual trades. However, just like other marketplaces on the clear net, like Amazon and eBay, One of the fundamental challenges in these kinds of online marketplaces, when they're dark, is how do you assess who you can trust with your money, who to order products from. And the way this has been solved is essentially the eBay way and the Amazon way with customer reviews. So typically for listings or for vendors, you would see people who've purchased products from them and then their kind of broad assessments. Sometimes it's just text, sometimes it's with a star rating. For us as researchers, at the moment, we're not yet necessarily looking at the content of the review, but for us, what's interesting is they're often time-stamped. So this gives us a broad indicator of volume of activity. So again, this data that we download, this then in aggregate allows us to observe this kind of trading activity over time, or at least the review posting activity over time. So we can already see these are weekly cycles. There's kind of a weekly cycle where on weekends people post less reviews. We can also see if this here is the total, about 70% of trades have a stated country of origin, which for our research purposes is great. This means we can meaningfully look at the geography of this kind of behavior. Let's make some maps. We've been making lots of maps in the last few weeks and months. I'm just going to show you a few. And also really just to give you a very broad sense of how this activity is distributed. So I showed you earlier, there's a lot of trading of recreational drugs. If we look at the distribution of the sales of cannabis, there's a big focus on trade in European countries, Central, Western Europe. You can see here in greater detail, the UK is generally very strongly represented in these kinds of activities, but also Germany, France to an extent. Australia has a lot of trading, is very active as well. North America, particularly the States. Other countries, not so much. Why that is, I think that's a large question, and that's certainly something that we also want to try and understand better. But we can already observe this is clearly geographically distributed. This is not just a global activity. Similarly with other recreational drugs, MDMA, here psychedelics. When we look at specific kinds of synthetic drugs, the pattern slightly shifts. So for example, with opioids, it's interesting to observe opioids, there are different categories. There's heroin, which is an organic opioid. So it comes from a plant. There are two producer countries for heroin that serve most of the supply for the global heroin consumption. There's kind of Central America, Mexico for the United States. And there's Afghanistan and surrounding countries, which mostly supplies Central and Western Europe. Neither of those are represented on these markets, which is an interesting observation in terms of economic geography. This means the places where those products are sold, these are not producer markets. So Afghanistan, Mexico, they don't actually participate on those markets. What happens instead is that those products get shipped, get prepared, gets shipped across country borders, repackaged maybe through multiple chains of middle people, and then they get put on these marketplaces. Similarly with designer drugs, new psychoactive substances, a lot of these, according to various research and criminology documentation, a lot of these substances are actually produced in China. And here we can actually see they're also on those marketplaces. Some of the vendors state that they are based in China. But in absolute numbers, by far the largest amounts of vendors of these substances are actually based in the UK and the United States. So again, a similar kind of pattern. I mentioned to you earlier, there's a large category of products or a large group of products that doesn't have a stated location of origin. It turns out when we look at information goods, digital products, these are stolen credit card numbers or accounts for logins for Amazon, for Netflix and other kinds of online accounts. These are generally the products that don't have a declared country of origin, because it's a digital product. You can provide it, you can serve it immediately. You don't need to ship it. So this again for us is quite interesting to see. that there's these kinds of two broad patterns of the physical goods where the shipping route is really important, and the digital goods where it doesn't matter at all. There's loads more I could say, but I think we don't have that much time here. Maybe just very briefly in closing, how are we getting the data? If you're broadly familiar with the kind of research that people have been doing along those lines, often people use a basic crawler like curl or wget or other kinds of software. For all kinds of reasons, we ended up writing our own. It's not very complex software. We use Scrapey or Scrapey, which is a Python scraper and crawler framework, which is very nice. And in parts, we use that. There are loads of details I could mention here, but just broadly speaking, one of the reasons we ended up going that route is because the websites that serve this kind of information, they're highly volatile for all kinds of reasons. There are different layers in the software stack locally and remotely, and it goes through routes, and servers go offline and all these kind of things. So we needed, on one hand, in order to deal with the scale of the data, we needed fairly sophisticated means of, or let's say non-trivial means of dealing with all kinds of error states. And we wanted to have really good alerting. We didn't want to end up in a situation where we only have a partial crawl and we don't really know what happened, or we find out too late. And yeah, Scrapey is great for that. Thanks. That's it.
On these markets, when vendors post their GPG key, have we done any research looking at which vendors are on like how many markets and where they might move to if markets shut down?
There's some published research where people have done that. So just for context, for those who don't know, as I mentioned earlier, at any given point there are many marketplaces, some more popular than others. And many vendors will create multiple accounts on multiple markets. And there's information that they post on their profile pages that we can use to then cross-reference them. So RJ is asking, do we understand how this kind of activity is distributed? I've not done this yet personally. I'm not sure yet whether we want to do it, but certainly people have done that. I think broadly the finding, as far as I've seen, also from my own kind of surfing of those markets, most vendors have multiple accounts, but it often ends up being decided on the demand side, on the buyer side, which marketplaces are then actually being used. So often there are various online forums where people kind of converse and try and understand which marketplace can I trust and so on. And there's on one hand there's rumors about places not to touch, and then there's preferences about places that are particularly shiny or have particular features. So from what I can tell, vendors mostly are in multiple markets because when the consumer base shifts, they want to already be there.
Hi, I know it's a difficult question. Can you hear me? But there has been some claims in the past that the Tor, even using a secure VPN, is not so secure as it claimed. What do you think about this? The government is already monitoring without telling, or the Tor distributed network is still very, very secure, or we don't know?
This is a complex question. I'll try a very short answer, because there is not a simple answer to it, because there are layers of software involved here. As far as has been published, as far as is known in the computer security community, the encryption protocol of Tor has not been broken. However, Tor uses the way most people use Tor is through a browser, which is generally a Firefox-based browser. And there are security holes in browser versions. So if you use Tor, make sure you update Tor. Additionally, depending on what kind of activity you do over Tor, there might be information leaks. In the simple cases, you post an email address that you also use in other circumstances. People have been arrested because of these kinds of transgressions. Or if you're dealing with a highly sophisticated opponent, maybe a government that has great resources to specifically set up traps or observational methods for you, then other risks emerge.
There's been some suggestions recently that darknet markets have been moving away from Bitcoin to other cryptocurrencies. I wondered if you'd done any research into what cryptocurrency usage was, whether it's been changing.
So because we don't see individual trades, we can't say which currencies have been used. In the end, we can see what is being offered by marketplaces and what capabilities marketplaces have and what do people talk about on forums. And generally, the impression is people switch to Monero. There are a few instances. Also, at the moment, there's a lot of Bitcoin hype. There was a fork, and there's like Bitcoin ecosystem is becoming complex and quite volatile, and Monero, I don't understand how it works, but it has stronger anonymity guarantees, whereas Bitcoin has barely any. It's not really an anonymous currency.
I was wondering if you'd correlated any of your findings with what happens in the not dark web, because the graphs you put up before, it looks awful that the US and the UK are doing lots of dark web stuff, lots of potentially illegal stuff. But I suspect what it's showing us was that the US and UK are just more developed e-commerce wise. I was wondering whether you tried to correlate and whether there are any interesting differences or similarities.
Yeah, so we've not done this work yet, but generally the assumption is it relates to a number of societal phenomena, and internet penetration is certainly among them. Generally, if you're familiar with any kind of internet research that tries to assess the geography of internet phenomena, is from Facebook use to other online platforms, this geographic distribution will be very familiar, because this is how the Western internet that we look at, this is how it's distributed. So in a way, you're absolutely right. I do think that there are also additional layers that we don't yet fully understand, which is about consumption patterns, for which we have some information from surveys and the UN ODC and the Global Online Drug Survey and so on. Is this about distribution patterns of these kinds of substances? There's maybe also about the local capacity to produce or to redistribute or repackage and so on. One question I was asked early on in conversation with someone was to what extent maybe this kind of trading activity might be happening also specifically in countries where there's high internet penetration but not necessarily yet strong regulation. So there was a suggestion that maybe there might be increased activity like this in parts of Eastern Europe, in maybe some Asian countries that don't necessarily have strong digital laws, these kinds of things. So broadly speaking, you're right, but I think it's also there are layers to it. But fundamentally we've not done the analysis yet, but I think it would be a very interesting analysis.
Hi, I was just wondering if you've done anything to categorize different types of products, markets. So, for example, you've done drugs, but things like the old school smuggling markets, like diamonds, or things like political material, I don't know, different those kinds of things.
I've not looked specifically at diamonds. Generally, what we found is so far. So there is this large chunk of uncategorized stuff where we might find some of those things. From what I've seen so far, most of what this is ebooks, tutorials, a lot of kind of digital stuff, porn, surprisingly. Not even very sinister porn, just porn. I've not yet seen strong indicators that there's a significant diamond trading market, but it would be interesting to assess.
Are you comparing value of goods? Because obviously when you're trading diamonds, you're probably making a very small number of very, very expensive purchases.
Yeah, this is a great point. I've not talked about price structures yet, and in part because we don't have a lot of time, but also because this has its own complexity, so we're not yet very advanced in our data there. But I think this is for us, for example, there's already already becomes relevant when we compare the practicalities of shipping a kilo of cannabis and a kilo of a new psychoactive substance. Because those chemical substances, they're highly potent. Doses are measured in micrograms. Generally the shipping amount is tiny compared to other kinds of drugs. So absolutely, these kinds of things matter when we try and assess how significant is this volume. Absolutely, you're absolutely right. We need to look at that as well. Maybe, yeah.
Do you see any correlation between government policy and what people are buying, and do you see any outliers at all that might be of interest? Thinking particularly things like FDA approval for drugs, or or things you can't get on the NHS, for example.
This is a great question. Thank you for that question. Also, it doesn't have a straightforward answer, but fundamentally, this is the kind of question that we as researchers, as social sciences researchers, these are the kinds of questions that drive our work. We're trying to understand fundamentally, now that these practices, these technologies exist, what kind of behavior do they support, but also how does this relate with policy, with public health concerns and related questions. The short answer is we've not yet done particular studies. There are certain things we can already look at where we wouldn't have time to go into the details. But for example, there was a recent crackdown of two of the largest marketplaces. And that happened just in the time when we were collecting data. So there we can already see what impact does it have on subsequent trading behavior. There was, when it comes to policy relating to substances, there was a change in legislation in many countries, including the UK, in the last few years, about the trading of new psychoactive substances. Spice and similar kinds of cannabinoid replacers or synthetic cannabinoids used to be legal until very recently, until governments realized the harms they can cause, and then they were criminalized. In principle, well, actually, no. As a consequence, there is published research already where these substances, which used to be traded openly online, now moved to these kinds of markets. So this is the kind of stuff where we're starting to gather knowledge. But fundamentally, I think there is a lot of work to do, and I think also a lot of policy questions that are very local, that are about particular countries or particular regions. Let's close it here. Thank you very much.